Hi, everyone, and thanks for listening. This is the Collective Health and Wellness Podcast with Eamon and Kat. We have a team of fitness and wellness coaches dedicated to helping you become a healthier, more productive version of yourself. Our mission is to provide you with information and opportunities to maintain a healthy lifestyle forever. Join us as we dive into our 4 pillars of health and wellness and give you ways to incorporate healthy, sustainable habits to last a lifetime.
Cool. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Collective Health and Wellness Podcast. We have our first guest. Taylor Wilkins is a longtime friend of mine from Boston when I was living up there. He and I have had a lot of really great conversations about the mental health, mental wellness side of things. He works in that realm and runs a few different projects as it revolves around that. And so I'm going to let him kind of like lead in and tell you a little bit about what he does. And then we're just going to kind of let the conversation flow and be very organic. So Taylor, nice. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm your first guest.
You are my first guest. Yeah.
Wow. Now, yeah, no pressure on me or anything, but I have to set the tone for all future guests now. Good. But yeah, thanks for having me. This is an honor and privilege, and I love you, so I love our conversation. So we might as well record it and share one.
That's it.
Yeah. So like you were mentioning, so I have worked in crisis mental health work for my whole career, so bordering on 15 years now, and all of the work I've done, so long story short, has culminated in helping people figure out the deeper existential questions of what am I doing with my life? Who am I? And what's my purpose here? The big philosophical questions. And the mental health aspect of that is all the anxiety and all the depression and all the existential dread that comes along with it, the emotional, the panic, the overwhelm of like, oh my God, does my life mean anything? Does this work that I'm doing every day mean anything? Is this all pointless? Is this all aimless? And so I work with a lot of those people that have those kind of swirling thoughts that get in the way of having a meaningful career, having a really healthy relationship, and just pursuing things that they're genuinely interested in the most basic and simple, non-soapbox sermon kind of way.
So everybody is what you're saying.
Yes.
I mean, I was, do you listen to the Huberman podcast?
I have before.
He just put out his most recent episode was about fear and anxiety and as it relates to like the human condition. So I'll send that over. I'll put that in the show notes too. It's he's such a smart dude, but yeah. So, I think there's a lot to be said in the failure of many, not necessarily businesses, although some businesses don't do a great job with this, but there's a failure even interpersonally of people recognizing other people's troubles and fears and not necessarily playing into that, but being aware of that and recognizing that is something that exists in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna let you talk more than me, but digging into that a little bit as it applies to, your everyday employee and kind of like maybe some like habits or skills they can build and work on in order to like kind of like address some of that.
Yeah. Start off with a really simple question. I appreciate that. Yeah. There are lots of ways I can dig into that. So yeah, I think the first part that you were touching on, kind of like the struggle we have of recognizing that other people are going through struggles. There's this quote I heard back in high school, I think, that is just like, so rudimentary and so basic that I don't think it registers very much with people, but it was something to the effect of like, be kind because every single person is fighting their own version of your battle. So whatever you're struggling with, everybody else has their version of a struggle too. And obviously it's on this massive, massive continuum, but we get so consumed with our own struggle that we have a very, very hard time acknowledging that these other people, especially if we work in a big office, we have a lot of, coworkers or whatever, we're just around a lot of people every day. We're all so good as adults at covering up our struggle, or we think we are, that we focus too much on our own struggle, or we put so much energy covering up our struggle that we're distracted from seeing that other people might also be struggling underneath, however they're behaving, however they're presenting. And so it unfortunately creates this massive culture of what I would call, psychological complacency, where we're causing ourselves a ton of pain. We're not acknowledging that we are in pain. We're not acknowledging that another person's in pain. And just, there's no cross connection of the wires, so to speak. We're all just operating in our struggle, in our pain, and people aren't talking about it. Even at this point, and I think, this is leading me into a tangent just about the mental health field in general, that the greater awareness of mental health issues is phenomenal and needs to happen, just like all the other cultural issues that are at the forefront these days that need to be talked about. But these types of struggles that I think you're hinting on in the workplace, or just these individuals sitting at their desk in their offices, they don't necessarily always relate what they're struggling with to quote unquote mental health issues. They just might think they hate their job, or they just hate their coworker, or the coffee they made that morning tasted disgusting. They don't know that there's like an actual deeper problem that they're not addressing. So they're just gaps, and they're just gaps in communication about these struggles. There are gaps in what we consider mental health issues. And that leads, especially in the corporate world or just in business in general, it leads to massive amounts of lower productivity, massive amounts of team communication issues. It can lead to hiring issues. It can lead to firing issues. It can lead to managerial issues. So there are just breaks in the chain all the way up the hierarchy.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit, but there's definitely a stigma as it surrounds mental health, mental resilience. But I think what we're doing these days within organizations, specifically since COVID started, is that a lot of companies are recognizing that, right? And, there is, so Taylor lives in New York City, and there was recently, I think I heard it on a podcast, or I heard it on the news or something. A lot of companies are starting to think about bringing employees back, right? So for in-person work in their office, et cetera, the organization, Priority Life Care, who I'm working with right now, who this is directly targeted at, they didn't really get that break, right? That they didn't have the option to work from home. But in New York City, a lot of these companies are slowly bringing people back. And with this new variant, the Omicron variant, or whatever variant, the flavor of the week it is.
I heard someone call it the Optimus Prime variant.
Yeah, right. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Employers are now like, maybe we should hold off and not bring people back into the office. And the employers that are bringing people back in the office, a lot of those employees are looking for other forms of employment where they can work from home. And like I said, with Priority Life Care, they don't necessarily have that option because their work revolves around service to others, right? It's a lot of people in the medical industry. It's a lot of administrators in the medical health and medical industry. And you can't really do that remotely, right? There's nothing you can do remotely because you're providing care for somebody.
Sure.
So, that's one of the things that I wanted to focus on with collective health and wellness is, giving that mental resilience a bigger seat at the table, because it is a method to increase productivity. It is a method to hire better. It is a method to have better lines of communication, which in my opinion, communication is the biggest struggle that a lot of companies have. It's fear of communicating, it's poor communication, it's lack of communication, right? So, let's kind of dig into that a little bit and maybe work with some maybe some like habits or skills people can build in order to help increase their communication to be able to talk about some of these things a little bit easier.
Sure. Well, firstly, I think it's critical to reiterate what you just said, that there are three aspects to the communication. There's the fear of communication, there's a lack of communication, and there's poor communication, right? And so a lot of people just think about the third one, which is whether the communication is good or bad. A lot of people don't talk about the fear of communication and the lack of communication, because communication is an active thing. And so that's really important awareness for people to have, just that it runs deeper than just someday you're like, I just don't want to have this conversation with my manager. You're not thinking about that. So, with that as kind of like the umbrella, to dig into what you're actually asking, what you told me before, and I think what you said earlier once we started recording, is that the two main aspects of this work that you're trying to do with these companies and with these employees is to build a community of introspection and changing habits. Those are like the two frameworks, basically. Obviously, you're great with the changing habits. And I will always scream from the mountaintops that we all need introspection. So I think that's the perfect order of things, because you can't change habits until you've introspected enough to know what habits you even want to change, like that are unique to you. And this is perfect that you and I are at least recording this in December. I don't know when you're going to put this out, but New Year's resolutions are always like the most entertaining time of year for me, because, and I'm sure this is the case with you too in the fitness industry, because everybody has glorious ideas about the habits that they want to change, but they're really not being real about what those habits actually are. So we could go on a whole tangent about that.
Yeah, the last podcast was about SMART goals and setting SMART goals, and one of the interesting the last 3 letters of the SMART goal is achievable, realistic, and time bound. And most of the time people are like, I'm gonna only eat vegetables for 6 months, and it's just like, it's like eating an elephant. You got to take one bite at a time, right? You can't like have this big, like, I love the big New Year's resolution where it's like, I'm going to go to the gym every day. And it's like, yeah, but life gets in the way sometimes. So yeah, go ahead.
And it's not even that healthy to necessarily, if you're going to the gym every day and you haven't been going to the gym every day. So there's an introspection example right there. So going back to talking about communication as the habit change that we want to make, it does have to start with introspection. And specifically what I mean by the introspection in this case is like, what you brought up some examples, but it's like, what is the conversation that needs to be had? So is it an employee that needs to talk about their mental health to a manager, or just needs some kind of resource? It just needs to advocate for their needs. Because even those two things are very different. And I'm just going to keep like parsing all these things apart, because the big problem is that, especially if people are stuck in the fear of communication, it means that they don't know necessarily how to have the conversation that they need to have. So it's uncertainty. And when we are uncertain about things, we become very overwhelmed. And when we're overwhelmed, we think we need to do something really, really drastic. But when we think we need to do something drastic, we freak out because like, oh my gosh, that feels really pressured. Now there's like a right or wrong aspect to it. When really you just have to make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to cure that overwhelm. And that's where a lot of people have trouble. They've never thought of that in that way. And so the two examples I just brought up, talking to your manager about mental health, about your mental health, is very different than just telling your manager that you need some kind of mental health support from somewhere. Even like if it's just asking them to give you a referral to a psychologist, or having someone on staff, or have someone come in once a week, what have you. That's very different than unloading all of your mental health struggles and emotional pain on your manager. So you have to become really, really clear throughout the whole company what conversations need to be happening before you can then say, okay, cool. Now I'm terrified of having that conversation. Then you ask, why are you afraid? Are you afraid that the manager is going to react in a certain way? Are you afraid that the manager is going to not take your mental health seriously? Are you afraid that your coworkers are going to find out?
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said within that context of making sure that the managers are also equipped to deal with some of this, right? Because it's not everybody has, and it's okay, not everybody has that empathetic ability to address that, right? Like it's, some people are just way more pragmatic about things, and they're like, yep, mental health issues exist, and it's like, I'm not skilled in handling that. So having an ability to kind of like take themselves outside of their normal, the managers outside of their normal behaviors, and allow them to just sit and listen, right? You don't need to solve any problems. When it comes to developing mental resilience, most of the time, people just need to talk. They just need to have a conversation and be heard. They're not necessarily trying to look for solutions, although they may be. But having the skill set to know where your boundaries are with that, and setting those boundaries with your manager, setting those boundaries with your employees, I think is also an important aspect of addressing mental health and mental resilience within any organization, right?
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah. I mean, of course, several things came up with that. So firstly, I completely agree with people like Simon Sinek and Gary Vaynerchuk, who are these more enlightened modern business leaders who are talking about how emotional intelligence is like the most important characteristic for good leaders and good managers. But like you said, it doesn't mean you need to be the most empathetic person. You can still be a hard-lined, old-fashioned, pragmatic manager that just wants to get to the bottom line, but just giving a moment of time to just hear what the employee has to say. Even a super pragmatic leader that's not very empathetic should be able to see that whatever that employee is going through is affecting the company, is affecting the employees, is affecting the culture. And so that keeps it more human for the manager to be like, oh gosh, this person, that's right, this is a human being who's part of this whole system. And like you said, I think a lot of managers think in this modern conversation about mental health that they need to be able to solve some kind of problem, and they just don't want to add that to their plate. Whereas they're not psychologists, they're not therapists. They don't need to solve the problem right there. But it is truly just about listening. Because the thing that came up for me as you were talking is that people do just need to talk it out. And even though that itself is a stigma in the therapy world about just talking about your feelings and somehow you're going to feel better, and that's what people joke around about, the real truth in it is that the majority of people who are unhappy or are having trouble with their mental health and they're going to work every day, they don't know what's real in their mind. They don't know what's real in terms of what they're feeling. They don't know what it means. They might be feeling all sorts of things. They might be feeling stressed, run down, burnt out, angry, irritable, but they don't know why. And so as soon as you start talking it out. And this is the same goes for journaling. Even if journaling is a version of talking it out, you're just not verbally talking to someone. The process is about making it real, figuring out what's real, what's not, what is this emotion, why am I feeling that one compared to that one. And so any conversation, whether it's with the manager or just any moment that you can talk it out and get it out of your head, is going to help.
Yeah, I think I had a thought in my head. Now I forget what it was.
Get it out, Eamon.
So you touched on almost like the compounding effect of stress and fear, and like people not knowing where it's coming from and what it's doing and what direction it's going to go in, right? So I think there's something to be said there for addressing it in small chunks. Doesn't only address the immediate need, but it also gives you skills to continue to develop that. Because once you start developing a skill set in anything that you're doing, whether it's fitness, whether it's, tracking your food, whether it's keeping an eye on your sleep or creating a good sleep routine habit, or it's talking about your emotional well-being, or, all that stuff is intertwined, but there's a compounding effect, either negative or positive. If you're not addressing it, it's not going to get better, right? If you are addressing it and you're attacking it in small incremental chunks, it gets easier to talk about. It gets easier to do. It gets easier to identify when emotions or feelings are affecting things outside of your normal, right? And it's also easier to identify when things are affecting your work productivity or your family life, which is, I know that this is a corporate health company, but, I talk a lot about family life and having a life outside of work, right? There's a difference between living to work and working to live, right? There's a two very different things there. And I think that recognition and putting yourself in other people's shoes and understanding where they're coming from makes it easier from a managerial standpoint to address those needs quickly.
Yeah. Mic drop. Well done. Yeah, absolutely. And what you touched on is really, really, really aligned with my work and my business and the type of people I've worked with in my entire career. Because if you see, the problem is that I've worked, so my whole career has been working with people in crisis, which means that they have to get to a moment of crisis before they either work with me or come to a program in which I used to work, like residential programs or inpatient programs, which means that they were not getting the help that they needed in some form or fashion until that moment of absolute crisis. Because I worked with so many suicidal individuals and suicidal teens that they clearly got to this point of making that choice. Or, it was either attempting suicide or trying one last thing of treatment, basically. And so the problem is we all still, like so many people still don't get help until they are at that like absolute worst. It's like in the past when I waited until I was really, really, really dreading going to work one day at a certain place I was working years ago, that I actually finally quit, not until like it was really affecting my health and I was waking up like really unhappy to go to work, that I finally think, all right, I should probably make a change.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So that's what I think is the norm, unfortunately. And a lot of people won't even just go start seeing a therapist until things seem really, really bad, or until their friends start to notice, hey man, like you should probably go see somebody, until it becomes a little more real of just like, oh, this issue is getting worse and worse. as opposed to what you're talking about, which is just small chunks. But for people to be able to start working on small chunks, they have to have that massive amount of awareness, massive amount of humility and vulnerability to say, hey, you know what? Something's not working. It's not totally ruining my life yet, but maybe there's something I should change here. And they just start to think differently about it. Or they start to, they ask a friend about it, or they ask a colleague, or whatever the little baby step is. But it takes a giant amount of awareness and vulnerability and humility to just take one of those first little chunk steps.
Yeah, I wrote a blog post for Collective Health that I called "Crossing the Threshold." Right, so it's and it's basically about just like taking that initial step towards anything, right? Mm-hmm. I think one thing that people have a really hard time identifying is what is that small incremental step that's gonna lead into something greater, right? Because they've tried, typically people who are in crisis or who are approaching a crisis event typically don't recognize until they get there, which is part of the problem, right? Mm-hmm. So being able to cross the threshold and be proactive about your mental resilience, I think that's an important aspect that people need to consider when we're talking about the 4 pillars.
Mm-hmm. So. Yes. And, the very, very concrete, tangible action step that somebody can take is figuring out and introspecting as New York City.
I was going to say, it wouldn't be a podcast with somebody from New York City if there wasn't some kind of siren or gunshot or something like that.
I know. And I think the ambulance is stuck in traffic right outside my building. So this is going to be good. It just adds drama to what I'm saying. But so what you're talking about is it's purely like someone needs to know what they're even wanting to achieve or what is their ambition anyways, because so many people, this ambulance is like totally stuck in traffic. I'm trying so hard.
No, I can barely hear it, so you're good.
All right, I can hear it. I think that's the problem. Anyway, so the problem is, and it's okay that that so many people, and especially corporate America, who work in large companies and sit at a desk all day long, none of us have to go get mental health help. It's everybody's choice, right? So if people want to just settle for a life that's unhealthy and they're not happy, they're unfulfilled, it's their prerogative. So the missing link for people like you're talking about who want to be more proactive is this longer term, or like this longer distance vision of what they even want out of life. So that's like the first criterion of just wanting more out of life than just settling, wanting more out of your health than just settling, wanting more out of your career than just settling for a job you hate. And so instead of just thinking about the chunks, we have to think long-term, like what's the ambition? Do I want to be fulfilled in my career? Do I want to have a body like Eamon's? Do I want to sleep however many hours per night? Whatever that is. And then you have to work backwards from that. But that's the lighthouse. You need a lighthouse before you can start rowing the boat.
Oh, that's a good analogy right there. Yeah. And I want to back up a little bit, because the suggestion sounds like if you're unfulfilled, just quit. Find something new, right? But I think what you're trying to get at is that's
not what I'm suggesting at all.
I think what you're trying to get at is it's so within priority life care, a lot of the employees are at entry-level positions, right? And I think something that's important that does help to kind of like tie into this, and maybe not necessarily put a pretty little bow on it, but it definitely like helps to kind of like start leading towards that lighthouse, so to speak, at least professionally, is just having that goal and then figuring out within your current situation or your current work how to continue moving towards that goal, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
At the beginning of this, we talked about college and the farce that college is, but that's a whole different conversation. It's two college educated guys saying college is stupid, but
that'll be the next episode.
Yeah. So a lot of the people that work within the organization haven't necessarily gone to college, and I think that that's honorable, because they basically jumped into a career path that is in service to others, right? Specifically our elderly, our elderly and underserved populations, which in my opinion, we talk about the greatest generation, right? Pearl Harbor was yesterday. Pearl Harbor Day was yesterday. It was 69 years since Pearl Harbor happened. No, that's wrong. No, 89 years. That's 20 years off, whatever.
Math.
So I think, getting into that career and putting those people at the forefront, there's a lot of very interesting paths that people can take to move up in that career if it's something that they're enjoying, right? They might start out as an aide, and then they move into being a nursing assistant, and then they move into being a CMA or a medication assistant, and then they are moonlighting at school or going through some kind of educational process to become an LPN, and then maybe they want to go and get their RN, and then maybe they want to go and so there's like having that, and those are the incremental chunks, right? It's like when I was in the military, I came in as a lowly undesignated guy. I didn't have a job title or anything like that. When I left the military, I was eligible for E6, which is within the enlisted ranks. It's kind of like the 6th step up out of the 9 steps that they have there. And it usually takes people within their career path about 10 years to get there. I achieved that within 4. And the only reason I achieved that within 4, and that's not me like patting myself on the back.
Yeah, but it shows how awesome you are.
I was a mess when I joined the military, right? Like my life was all over the place, which is the reason I joined. But when I got in there and I found that organization to be something very powerful for me, I was like, okay, what's the next thing? Okay, I've checked that box. What's the next thing? Okay, I've checked that box. What's the next thing? And those are the small incremental steps that I made, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think there's something to be said about having that lighthouse, but then understanding what that path looks like and understanding it's not linear, right? There is going to be kind of like this ebb and flow, but as long as we can create a cross section that is on an upward trend, we're heading in the right path.
Yes, 100%. And I love that you brought that up. And thank you for clarifying what I had tried to say while I was listening so hard to the ambulance, because honestly, it felt like I was screaming at you, Eamon, because the ambulance was so loud for me. So if the thought didn't come across clearly, or the suggestion, or it sounded like the suggestion was to go quit your job, sorry about that. Blame the ambulance. But anyways, yeah, now that it's quieter, I love that point. And what I really, really want to drill home is the fact that the lighthouse doesn't even need to be concrete. The lighthouse could be as simple as just saying, I want to improve my physical health. That's it, right? It doesn't need to be, I want to lose 50 pounds by next week, or run a marathon by next year. It doesn't even need to be that specific, because by the time you actually get to that point, your goals will have changed. You will have changed. Your interests might have changed. Your ability to communicate will have changed. So it may no longer be about running a marathon at the end of next year. it could be about something totally different. And so to your point, and using that example of you in the military and these people at the facility that you're connected with, it is about, you have to make sure that, or if your ambition in the lighthouse is towards some kind of general category, but from there, like you said, you can either, if there's a hierarchy, you can say, okay, cool, that next position is the next thing I'm shooting for. Even within that, though, you can be like, okay, cool, well, what do I need to do to get to that position? And then you can introspect of like, ooh, this is an interesting process. Because I'm sure for you, like once the military gave you some more structure and gave you some direction, you enjoyed the process of like, ooh, how do we get to the next thing? Right? You're a competitor.
Like 80% of the time I was like, oh, what's the next thing? And sometimes I was like, man, this sucks.
Of course. And there'll always be that. But something that came up that seems relevant to share is that when you're in the pursuit of what you think is the next step, always be aware that that next step is never the last step. There will always be something more to do. Even if you get to the CEO level, like you are the boss, you're the absolute boss, there's literally no position higher. There are companies that either make new positions, or there's just more you can end up doing in your position that is more rewarding or different. So there's always the next phase of what may be fulfilling or healthy toward whatever your lighthouse is. And so I work with a lot of people. The word purpose comes up so much in my work because everybody wants to know their purpose in life. And I work with people who think that next level of the military or of the hierarchy is their ultimate goal. And then as soon as they get there, they're actually not as fulfilled as they expect it to be. It's the same with people in the health world. You know this from doing CrossFit. As soon as somebody actually loses 50 pounds, then what? They need that next goal. And it all needs to be going to something bigger than that, because it's not totally defined or concrete. So it's sort of this dance of just knowing that there's always more to explore if you want to explore, and not marrying yourself to the next step being like the end all be all of your happiness.
Yeah, it's an iterative process, right? So the iteration isn't necessarily linear. There's a number of directions you can go with any position that you're in, right? Mm-hmm. I think what's important to note is that you should always be striving for not perfection, because I think that creates a weird like misnomer, because
it doesn't get me started.
Yeah, because it doesn't allow for the learning process to happen, right? If you're always striving for perfection at everything, you'll be very unfulfilled because it doesn't happen.
Oh yeah.
Right. So, but striving towards being a lifelong learner, being somebody who is always looking for the next challenge or process to learn, or I'm a creative, but not a creative in that like I'm not going to be putting together like marketing campaigns and things like that. I'm a creative in that like I like to look at processes and see how they can be improved upon, right? And I like that process of trial and error that is associated with that. Because 9 times out of 10, it's an error, right? But, that's, I talked a little bit on the last podcast about the Japanese method of Kaizen. I don't know, are you familiar with Kaizen? Mm-hmm. It's like an iterative process, right? You go through something and you kind of, even if you put it up on a whiteboard. When I was at Boeing, that's what they did with aircraft design, is they would put the entire design of an aircraft from an engineering standpoint on this big whiteboard when they were designing a new aircraft. And they would go through and mark things off and have like these little like tangents on like how they can improve just that one specific little part. And they'd step back, look at the big picture, and then go back in. So that ability to go from that, 10-foot view to that 10,000-foot view of a process, I think is a skill set that people can build upon. And being willing to do that and realize that, the whole old school theory of failure is not an option. I don't believe in that in most cases.
Right.
But I think failure is just a part of the process, and understanding how to take that in as not as a recognition of who you are as a person, but saying, okay, I learned something here, and being able to walk away with that silver lining, as opposed to feeling beaten down and downtrodden and like, man, I suck, or I did this horribly, or, I'm never going to do this again, or a failure. Those words are, I think that is where the failure actually happens, right? Is the inability to have like a little bit of humility, or inability to recognize the silver lining and try to improve upon that process. So.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, I think failure, I completely agree. And it's also now so trendy to say failure is part of the process and it's just a lesson to be learned. And the problem with that is that there's nothing emotional about it. What is emotional is the connotation that we've attached to the word failure. Like, even if you say the sentence, failure is great, everybody who hears the word failure is going to feel shitty when they hear that sentence. They're not going to focus on the fact that it's great. They're going to focus on the fact that you said the word failure, and failure is awful, right? And so it's absolutely a semantic thing, just in the same way that you just said the self-talk is purely a vocabulary thing. And I'm not saying necessarily that we need to change the vocabulary of failure or change the word, or use a different word for it or something, maybe, who knows, but that's the hook. That's the snag that people, it's just that connotation. It's just so heavily enriched with negative connotation, that word failure, that it's very hard for people to decouple that and think, oh, cool, I failed. Awesome.
Yeah.
let's do it again.
Except better this time. We're going to fail better.
Exactly. Right. And I know it's one of the business or marketing gurus who said it, but it's just like, yeah, fail better, fail harder, fail upward, just fail forward. Yeah. I probably just quoted like 3 different people in that, but yeah.
That's great. All right. I think we got to cut this a little bit, cut this short now. We usually do 30-minute podcasts. I think we're a little bit over, but I'm totally fine with that because it's a good conversation. We'll definitely going to have you back on, man. I love seeing your face, and I love the thought process you have with a lot of this stuff. And I think people can really benefit from hearing what you have to say. And I think people can really benefit, at least me personally, I've always benefited by being in your presence. So I appreciate you, man.
Thank you.
I'm gonna ask you to leave us with a book recommendation or a podcast recommendation that people can either listen to, or something that has maybe had an important influence on your thought process with things.
Sweet. Okay. Book recommendation. The one that always comes to mind is called ISHMAEL by Daniel Quinn. Have you read it?
Yeah, I have.
Oh gosh. Yeah. It's so I've reread. I mean, like I have like 7 books that I'm in the process of reading right now.
Always.
So I know I'm really bad at finishing books fluidly, but ISHMAEL I've reread numerous times throughout my life. I read it in college, and that just, it always resonates with me. It always cuts to the core of like what's going on in society. It's just, it all comes down to levers versus takers. Like, what's the attitude that you have towards your life? Are you leaving something behind? Are you helping perpetuate something good? Or are you just taking from others, taking from the world? So it's just such a great an amazing story and lesson. And then podcast wise, especially related to mental health things, I've been listening to the Rich Roll podcast quite a bit. Are you familiar with him?
No.
Okay, so
I'm familiar with Rick Roll, but that's totally different.
That's different. Yeah, that's different. That's another podcast. Rich Roll, like he's, like a marathoner, and he does all sorts of the longer ultra marathons, endurance races and things. And he has a past of serious addiction and has documented his whole rehab story. And so he has a plant-based diet and everything. And so his whole podcast, he has people on who are related to, nutritional wellness, but also primarily like mental health, mental wellness, lifestyle, happiness, things like that. And there were several in particular. There was an interview with what's his name, Father Mordecai Finley. Is a rabbi, and he has this just incredible process of just how to live life. He's basically like a psychologist acting as a rabbi. He has like his own like whole curriculum and method of like counseling people. And then the other one I would recommend is his interview with Stephen Pressfield, who's the writer of The War of Art, which just talks all about how we can break through, how we can acknowledge and accept our resistance and the things that hold us back in order to be creatively free and productive and successful. So that book, his book, and that interview definitely changed my life as well. So there you go.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you being on. We'll definitely see you again soon.
Thanks so much, Eamon.
All right, guys, check out the show notes for how to contact Taylor if you want to get a hold of him. And like a summation of kind of part of our conversation, I'll include those podcasts and the book in there as well. So we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thanks a lot for listening. We appreciate your support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast and giving us a 5-star rating. If you'd like to leave direct feedback, leave us a comment on our YouTube channel, Collective Health and Wellness Corporate. Wishing you all the best this week, and we'll talk to you next time.